Let's give a big round of applause to Mr. J. Walker.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then since it's much more interesting to answer questions than it is to hear some speakers speak, I will do my best to answer any questions that we might have. You know, as inventors, we spend a lot of our time sort of trying to figure out the future and looking to the future as a place that our inventions or our innovations will be profitably rewarded, successful, etc. But one of the things that inventors and entrepreneurs often fail to do is spend enough time looking at the past. Because looking at history often provides a lot more value for your time than trying to figure out the future, which is a bit counterintuitive. You would think, as an inventor, you'd want to spend all of your time thinking about tomorrow's needs, tomorrow's problems, tomorrow's opportunities. And of course, you do need to do that. But by failing to study history, you limit yourself to generally only achieving a small fraction of the economic gain or the financial success you might otherwise achieve. And the reason for that, there are actually many reasons, but the primary reason for that is that most inventors have no idea of the full problem they've solved. And that's because typically the nature of innovation and invention is about focusing on one thing. You say, boy, if I could just make a bicycle that could be this, or if I could just make a gear that would do this, or if I could write a piece of software that could do this, or if I could come up with a new principle to make this more efficient, I would be more successful. And what you learn when you study the history of inventors is you learn that inventors are almost, successful ones, are almost always wrong about the problem they've solved. Almost always wrong. They think they have solved one problem, and the successful ones have all solved a whole different problem. And this comes as a surprise to inventors who often think, wow, inventors must really be focused, must really know what they want to accomplish and what they want to do. And so when they finally succeed, they must feel great that they've accomplished exactly what they've set out to do. And that's just not the case at all. You know, Alexander Graham Bell is a perfect example. The man was trying to figure out a way for deaf people to hear better. Okay, his wife was deaf, his mother was deaf, and Alexander Graham Bell was a teacher of the deaf. And so what he did was, like any good scientist of his age, he began working on problems of how you could communicate better with the deaf. Hard of hearing, in his case. Right? And he spent 20 years working on ways that he could amplify sound so that deaf people would be able to hear better. If you look today, of course, at the result of the telephone and all the rest of it, we now know that the deaf was the least of what Alexander Graham Bell really solved, right? But never did Alexander Graham Bell ever think that his telephone was going to be used in any way near the way it has been used from history. This is true for George Westinghouse, a name that's familiar to most of us. George Westinghouse made his fortune because he devised a better way to stop railroad cars. He actually devised a set of air brakes for railroads. And in their day, railroads were every bit the internet, what the internet is today. But actually what Westinghouse was working on was a better piston system. And he was coming up with ways for pistons to operate better. And he had no idea that his piston invention would ultimately make him many, many times a multimillionaire by applying it to the railway car problem of how you slowed and stopped a railway engine. Right? Now, it's not only a case of understanding what the problems that your invention can solve that leads to success, but it's often a case of aligning your inventions with bigger networks. Right? And typically, what happens is great fortunes are often made when people not only solve a problem in a small sense and then generalize it to a much bigger set of problems, but they do so in a way that leverages some large-scale network of the age. All right? Now, what do I mean by a network? Well, you know, we're familiar, of course, today with the internet or with the broadcast television network or the highway network or the electrical network in this room. But networks are effectively large collections of interconnected elements that operate in some combined capacity to achieve a much greater result than any one element of that network. So think of the highway network as a series of roads and signs and bridges and tunnels, any one of which is no big deal, but if you put them all together, the highway network is clearly a big deal. Well, when you start to think about your invention and how it relates to modern networks, you start to unlock value that in many cases is invisible. So for example, Sears Roebuck was a small catalog operation. Roebuck had invented it at the time. All right, and it was a relatively local concept of a mail order catalog. And with the advances of the post office and the postal network and the railroad network, suddenly the idea of a mail order catalog that could be operated nationally became a much more powerful invention than simply a little catalog that he published in the Chicago area for local delivery. In other words, by taking the invention of a method of essentially mail order selling locally or local selling, he generalized it by hooking it up with the postal network. And of course, in its age, the Sears Roebuck catalog was the great dominant form of merchandising of its time. And this idea of attaching your invention to a network is often the simplest way to increase the value of your invention, sometimes between 10 and 1,000 times. So taking a simple idea that might look good all by itself, if you can bridge it to a network, if you just get to a network with it, suddenly it becomes enormously more valuable. For example, Thomas Edison, who invented, among many things, the long-lasting filament. He didn't really invent the light bulb, as you all know. He invented a filament that lasted 20 hours, which in its day was a big deal. Never made any money really selling light bulbs. He made all of his money persuading people that an electrical network was what was needed, along with the power stations, the power lines, the power grids, etc. He unfortunately believed in a DC current network, which wasn't the practical network, but nonetheless, it was all about light bulbs being connected to an electric network that makes the bulbs valuable. In fact, most of the value is typically created at the network level. Right? There's not a lot of money in selling the light bulbs in this room, but there's a lot of money in selling electricity, the generators, the transformers, the wiring, etc. So the value chain is often in the network itself. A good example of this in our time is the credit card. The credit card, as usual, was not invented for the purpose that we use it today. The credit card was originally invented as a convenience charge card. It was invented by Diners Club for businessmen. And the idea that Diners Club had at the time was, I'll give a card to businessmen who are having business lunches in New York and Chicago, and instead of having to take at the end of the meal and argue about who's going to pick up the check or worry to have enough money, you would just give this convenience charge card to the restaurant, and the restaurant would then send the information to a combining organization, Diners Club, which would then send a bill, and you'd pay the bill. Okay? Now, that idea, an executive product for businessmen, of course, is not what the credit card is all about. The credit card became a solution to a much bigger problem. And the problem was, how does a bank make a small loan to millions of people every day? Well, if you're a bank and you want to lend somebody $23 and $32 and $46, you really can't do that as a bank. You can't get a loan officer every time you take out your charge card. But what a credit card did was it allowed the option of not only paying your bill in full each month, a la Diners Club, but not paying your bill is where all the money is. Okay? In the credit card business, it's the fact that the bank takes advantage of the fact that in many cases, you don't want to pay your bill for something you thought you were going to pay your bill for, and suddenly you're running up a loan to the bank at nice levels of interest. I can still remember my daughter going, interest? You have to pay interest? Okay. So suddenly there is over $2 trillion of credit card loans outstanding. Just imagine trying to make $2 trillion of loans, $30 and $50 and $75 at a time. Now, if somebody in the banking system had sat down and said, how do we make millions of loans, $25 at a time, it's very possible the credit card would have been invented 30 years earlier than it was. But it wasn't, because nobody ever had the insight to say, we're a bank, we loan money to people. How can we loan $25 to people? How can we do it 1 million times a day? And the answer, of course, is you hook it up with the phone network. And the phone network is how the credit card, how the merchant or the store validates the fact that you have a credit line available in real time so that the store can get paid immediately by the bank, and the bank can then syndicate a loan to you in small amounts of money each time. This idea of not knowing what you're inventing is not only common and is not only almost universal, but it's even in our most famous success stories of our time. Everybody knows the story of Google, since most people in this room certainly use it. Now, when you talk to the Google guys and you ask them what they invented, what they would tell you is they invented a better search algorithm. That's what Larry and Sergey would say. They say, well, we have just a better search algorithm. And when Microsoft had a chance to buy Google very early on, Bill Gates naturally said, why do we have to buy a search engine from two guys out of Stanford? We're Microsoft. We can buy a much better we can build a much better search engine than these silly guys out of Google. We don't need to buy Google. We just we'll make our own search engine. You see, Google hadn't really invented a search engine, though they had a better search algorithm. What Google invented was a direct marketing system. Actually, didn't invent it, they bought it, that's the truth. But that's another story. Those little things, what pays for Google are those little AdWords that are alongside. Those are little paid links alongside your search. Your search is free. About 1 out of every 200 searches, somebody presses one of those paid ad links, and Google gets paid somewhere between 50 cents and $10, depending on the word you're linking. In other words, Google is a direct marketing system masquerading as a search engine. Now, if you talk to the Google guys, they'd still tell you they were a search engine, even though now we know they're the most successful direct marketing system ever created. And the vast majority, 99% of Google's revenues come either from the paid links alongside the free searches or from the AdSense network, which is their distribution of more paid links to other websites that can't have a sales force in order to get paid links. So this type of not knowing what you're doing, okay, is not only common, but gives inventors who understand this premise an enormous advantage. Because whatever problem you actually think you've solved, you can be sure you're wrong. You haven't solved that problem. You've probably solved 50 other problems at the same time. In other words, if you've solved one problem, you've probably solved a more important problem. You just haven't looked for it. In many cases, it's the unanticipated problems that you can look for if you have the discipline and the hard work to do it. And it happens time and time again. However, if you don't look, you generally won't find it. And if you're lucky, it may find you, or if you're lucky, it may evolve into something which takes a lot longer. But generally speaking, it pays to actually spend time figuring out what other problems have I solved with my solution. And it also pays to say what other classes of problems are similar to mine. Because in many cases, what you'll see is somebody has solved a problem right over here. And with just a little twist, they've solved a much bigger problem on a network over here. Remember, if we can get ourselves to a network, we get a lot more value for our time spent solving problems. So what are the big networks you got to get to? Every age has its networks. Our age is no different. If you study history, you'll see all these wonderful networks in every age. Our age actually has 3 giant networks and one thing that isn't a network, but is as powerful as one, which is unusual. And the first network we have, of course, is the data network. We call it the internet, but it's really much more. The data network contains the mobile phone network, it contains the regular phone network, and it contains the data network. So all of the information in our world is moving over the data network, and if you can take your invention and bridge it to the data network, odds are it's already worth 10 times more the minute you can touch the data network. No matter what it is, get it onto the data network, and it's much more valuable. Keep it isolated off that data network, usually not worth nearly as much. Right? Even things that are highly physical, package delivery on Federal Express, become much more valuable when you can track that package on the data network. Because once you can track a package, you're much more likely to send a package. You're much more likely to have confidence the package is going to get there. You're much more likely to understand that the value of using that network or that package supplier is better. You might not send it through the post office because their tracking network is no damn good. Even if their delivery network were better. Right? So there's a good example. The second big network of our age is the biology network, which is us. We have begun to unravel in our time the network of us. Right? All the talk about the human genome and all the talk about understanding how our body systems work and understanding our genetic code, that's all about the data network that we are. Every one of us are a series of systems integrated into a network. And all of the work being done today in all of the biological sciences are all about trying to figure out how to take what we know and bridge it into the data network that is us. The DNA code, the information systems, the war on cancer, diseases, all those things are all about trying to get on the bio network that you and I and everybody in this room is, because we are all just biological networks. Remember, once I can get into one biological network, the odds are it's going to work in a lot of biological networks. And so that's the second big network of our time. The third big network of our time is the global energy network. You know, we hear a lot about green and all the things related to green, but at the end of the day, it's about energy and it's about moving it. Right? If you can't move it, it's not worth a whole lot. Right? What we've done is we've built a giant energy network in our world. Oil tankers are part of the energy network. The electric grid is part of the energy network. Pipelines are part of the energy network. Gas lines are part of the energy network. And it's all around us. In this room, of course, we're sitting in the middle of a vast grid of energy sources all around us. So the energy network is a network with enormous opportunity. Why? Because fundamentally our energy network is pretty old. It's an industrial energy network. It's not very smart. Not a lot of smart devices in our network. It's very non-connected. Pieces of it are not connected to other pieces of it. And it's clearly in need of a massive overhaul as we learn on our planet how to do much more with the energy we need to get without destroying the planet in the process. So we're learning about the need to invent things related to the energy network. So for those of you that are working on anything that relates to energy, get it to the grid. Get it to the network somehow. If you can get it to the network, your value goes up, and it goes up dramatically. So those are the three big networks of our time: the information network, the biological network, and the energy network. I mentioned there was a fourth thing in our time that is an exception to the rule, and it's a fairly unusual one. It happened last in the age of mechanical devices, at the beginning of the industrial age. And that is the understanding of the manipulation of nanotechnology scale items. Nanotech just means billions. Nano refers to billionths of a meter. Wavelengths of light are measured in nanometers. Viruses are the size of nanotech. DNA is nanotech. It turns out that if you can take an invention and bridge it to the world of the very, very small, then it doesn't matter what network you work on. Because nanotech connects to the biological network, nanotech connects to the electrical network, and nanotech connects eventually to the information network. So it's one of those very unusual times in history where you have a fundamentally new technology taking place. Electricity was an example of this, a fundamentally new technology where electricity affected all kinds of networks in the world, even though electricity was ultimately harnessed and put on its own network. So those are the ways of taking inventions you have today and bridging them to the three great networks of our age, or bridging them into this horizontal sort of force multiplier in nanotechnology. So once we understand that, we look and say, all right, what else is unique and different about our time that we might be able to sort of take away in a short talk here that would be helpful for those of you that are innovators and inventors. And there's a big change that's taken place in the last really 10 years in our world. And that is, we now as inventors have an opportunity to not just invent our products and services, but we have an opportunity to actually invent the businesses that wrap around our product and services. It used to be businesses were fairly stable thoughts. If you had a product, you sold it in a retail store, or you might sell it by a mail order catalog. But you didn't have a lot of choices. If you had an industrial product, you had to sell it to industry. If you had a telephone product, you had to sell it to the telephone company. Well, that's not true anymore. Because of the nature of innovation today, you can innovate how you sell things or how you create businesses around things. For example, you can have a video game where the whole concept of the video game is to buy virtual items. There are millions and millions of people who buy virtual fake things. So those of you that are young enough to play video games in this room would know this, which is a giant business in the world, right? Literally buying virtual items. Now, that's a business model that nobody who created video games had ever conceptualized. They'd always say, well, if you create a game, you've got to sell the game. No, you don't. In fact, you can give things away in all kinds of businesses today and make money by the small portion of people that are willing to pay you. Look at Google again. They give away 1 billion searches a day, and they make money from about 10 million searches a day from somebody who clicks on a link. That means 9.99 billion of them are given away. I'm sorry, 0.99 billion are given away free every day. So we have a completely different structure in our world today, where we can invent entirely new businesses to wrap around our products. We can have our product where the business is an ongoing set of upgrades. We can have our product where the business is buying a premium version, but you give away a baseline version to people free. We can have a product where the product doesn't cost anything, but we charge for communities of people to talk about the product. We can have a product where we give it away for free and we survey what people think about the product, because that turns out to be valuable to other companies that want to sell similar products. In other words, there's a million different ways to create value in your inventions. Not just from the invention itself, but you can create value by designing the business around the invention. This is very unusual. You look back in history, you don't see this too often. Right? And it's because of the multiplicity of ways to market in the data age that we live in. It's because you've got 57,000 videos a week being uploaded to YouTube. It's because you have Facebook and MySpace, and it's because you've got globalization, and it's because you've got billions of text messages and things move at the speed of a joke. It's because of the interconnectedness of the world we live in, both in a video and text way, that it's possible for the first time to really be in charge of your own marketing without having to rely on the permission of a big company, a government, or some standards-making body for you to go directly to your customers or to your potential customers and create revenue for yourself. Which brings me to my final point. In addition to thinking about your businesses around it, storytelling turns out to be a critical dimension today for a successful inventor. In other words, if you want to be a successful inventor, you must become a successful storyteller. Now, in the past, there was sort of this metaphor which, if you have a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. Now, for those of you that are inventors, that was never true, but it always sounded good. The fact of the matter is, if you have solved a problem, 99% of the people who should be your customers are going to think you haven't solved it. Even if you prove you've solved it, they're not going to believe you've solved it. They've got too many vested interests in saying, that's not going to work. We tried that before. We saw something just like that. My boss won't let me. You pick your reason. But if you can tell a story about your product or service, about your invention, suddenly that story takes on a life that multiplies the value of your product. And by the way, it's not just one story. You need a 30-second story, a 60-second story, a 5-minute story, and a 20-minute story. You need all 4 of those stories, because depending on how long the person has to listen to you, an elevator ride is where you're going to use that 30-second story, hence the term elevator pitch. Okay? But you need the story in all lengths. And if you can't tell that story so it's clear and simple, and so that your grandmother can tell it to her friends at the bridge club, then you don't have a story. Because stories in the modern age are simple, they're compelling, they're easy to repeat, and they deliver the value of what you have achieved so that somebody else can understand it. In other words, if people aren't telling your story, it's not their fault, it's your fault. Now, it's hard to be a storyteller. It takes real work. In fact, we employ full-time storytellers at Walker Digital. I run an R&D lab, and we have full-time storytellers, including a vice president of stories. Okay? Because without stories, we can't explain our inventions to people. And if we can't explain our inventions to people, there's no hope that they're going to want to try them, buy them, or ask us more questions about them. In other words, storytelling is as important in its way as getting the invention to solve the problem is in its way. So to summarize, okay, there are 3 big changes that I'm suggesting that you might want to consider to add more value to what you're doing. Okay? The first change I'm suggesting is learn a little bit of history. It's never a waste of time to study the history of invention, the history of technology change, the history of what the area or industry you're working in. The more you can understand that history, the more likely you are to see patterns that have happened before that are going to happen again just using new technology. People's desires, behaviors, fears have not changed in 10,000 years. Greek plays are just as powerful as when the Greeks wrote them. Okay? That's because we're the same people. So if you understand history, you have an enormous edge over people who don't understand history in being able to figure out how to create more value for the time and effort you put into your innovation. The second is get yourself to a network. Whatever you've invented, get it to a network, whether it's to the data network, to the bio network, or the energy network. Those are the three great networks of our age. Get it and connect it to one or more of those networks. That gives you leverage and it gives you power. You may be close enough. You may not have solved it exactly right, but don't expect to have solved it right. Expect to understand that you're going to have to adapt it to fit the network. And lastly, you need to learn how to tell stories. Short stories, medium stories, and long stories, but they all have to be repeatable like fairy tales. They've got to be simple, understandable, something that anybody of any age can repeat to somebody else and get it. If they can't repeat it and get it, then start again until they can. In other words, it isn't about the customer, it's about you being able to explain your benefits so anybody can understand it. With those three thoughts, I think you've got a different approach to looking at the future. I haven't talked at all about tomorrow, though it's an important part of what you're working on. But you don't need me to tell you about how to fill market needs or how to see opportunities. That's what you do all day. That's where everybody's looking. So that's a good place to look, and I'm not suggesting you don't look there. But I am suggesting that you look at those three ideas and incorporate them into your thinking. And if you do, I promise, you'll not only generate more profit for yourself, but you'll have a much better time doing it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The question is, what do we start with the Priceline and how do we solve it? Well, we had an unusual problem. We knew that at Priceline we were working on the problem of uncollected demand. We basically said, look, in the world there's all this demand for products and services that doesn't get filled. So for everybody who wants to buy something and actually buys it at a price, there are all these people that want to buy it at a lower price, and it just doesn't get filled. Right? And we said there must be a way to use the internet to collect demand. Demand is basically people who want to buy something and really want to buy it. And so we began working on a demand collection system. How would that work? And we said, well, the internet's too complicated. We'll have to use telephones. That's what we thought at first. And we said, we'll just create a phone service where people will call and tell us how much they wanted to pay for something. And at the time, we said, well, what industry do we want to work that on? And we spent a lot of time thinking about various industries. Now remember, we had an advantage. We were full-time R&D people, and we've been through this process many times. And we focused on the airline industry because we said, wow, those guys have 2 million empty airline seats every day. And a plane that takes off with empty seats, never going to make any money from those seats. So we knew that was a perishable product, sort of like fruit. And if we could collect demand, that would be fantastic, because then the airlines could choose to fill some of the demand below the retail price line, hence the name of the company. The name of the company is about an intellectual problem, the price line. Well, we went and called on every airline in America, and they all laughed at us. And they said, get out of our office. We have no desire to collect demand. You'll destroy our brand quality. Everybody will want to fly on my airline, and that'll be no good, because I'll never sell another product again at full price. And we said, that's not going to work. Okay. So we went back and we said, how do we solve that problem? We ultimately said, well, let's make the product unspecified. So the customer who made an offer for an airline ticket wouldn't know what airline they were flying on. So we went back and said, hey, we got a new idea, airlines. We said, they're not going to know what airline. And they said, nah, that's not going to work. Nobody's going to fly in airlines where they don't know what airline they're going to go to. And we basically went through an iterative cycle where we continuously dumbed down the product in order to satisfy the supplier. So you didn't know what time of day you would fly, on any time of the day, on any airline. You wouldn't even know if it was a nonstop or a one-stop, because we had to dumb the product down before the suppliers would come in. But that's fairly common. You go through a series of product adjustments in order to try to make it a balance of success between the supplier, if you will, in this case, the customer. And that's exactly what happened. And then every airline told us to still pound sand, that it wasn't going to work. Every last one of them. So we said, God damn it. They said, nobody's going to give you a real offer, even with a credit card. Your system is never going to work. Which is pretty normal. If you're an inventor and you don't hear that your thing is never going to work, then you're not an inventor. Okay? And we said, what do you mean it's never going to work? They said, well, nobody's ever going to give you that demand, at that. And plus the prices are going to be crappy. They're all going to put in $10. And we said, no, they'll give us real prices. And so what we did was we set up a travel agent and we announced we were in business and we bought tickets that we started launching the advertising and we announced that you could name your own price for airline tickets and we had no supply, which is a bit of a problem when you're in business, okay? But we bought the supply at full price and we bridged the difference ourselves. So we were losing money on every ticket, as I like to joke, and we made it up in volume, okay? And so, but what we really were doing while we were financing the difference of losing money on every ticket was we were proving that customers were willing to give us bona fide offers at real prices every day. And as we started to get 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people who were coming to us every day, and then 10,000 people giving us real prices for real city pairs, we then went back to the airlines and said, we're getting real business, okay? You see, there is a segment of customers who are willing to trade off in classic sort of disruption theory. Okay, there is a classic set of customers who don't need to know what time of day they're flying. They're students or retirees. Don't care what airline they're flying. They're just trying to get there at the cheapest price. You know, are willing to take a stop if that's necessary, as long as it's on a major carrier. And only after proving it for almost 2 months, spending a fortune of money that we had raised, okay, to prove the point, did airlines finally relent and say, wow, and only one of them at the time, said, wow, you really do have people who we could put on our airplanes. And that's the story of how we did it. And that's a fairly common story if you look through history of how inventors can't be stopped by people who are going to say, well, this isn't going to work. You have to prove it's going to work. Well, how do you prove something is going to work before it works? In many cases, you have to subsidize it yourself. You have to get the customers yourself. You have to demonstrate that there's real demand and not just a prototype. You have to demonstrate it's going to work in the marketplace, because until you do that, nobody in power is going to believe that's going to work. Okay? And that's normal. You know, the bigger the problem you're trying to solve, the more people are going to tell you that your solution is either no damn good, stupid, tried before, never will work, can't possibly work, inefficient, uneconomic, illegal, you pick it. Okay? That's the nature of invention. If you don't have a thick skin, you're in the wrong line of work. Okay? But that's the story of how we did it at Priceline. Other questions? Questions, what did we learn from patents? We had some patents at Priceline. First of all, inventors especially misunderstand patents. And so let me give you a 2-minute course that'll probably help you. All a patent does is prevent margin compression. That's what a patent is all about, okay? A patent is all about trying to maintain the margin on your innovation. Right? If you have a good patent, which is hard to get for a variety of reasons, you typically need a whole series of them, but if you have effective patent coverage, it prevents competitors from directly copying you, in theory, only if you have several $1 million to sue them for years. Okay? And it just means that they can't compress your margins. So if you have no patent, right, Google has no patents to speak of, Walmart has no patents, that's not the problem at Google and Walmart. Okay? In other words, patents just prevent somebody from compressing your margins. But there are a lot of ways to prevent people from compressing your margins that are much more reliable than patents. A superior product that constantly innovates, a powerful partner that's in the marketplace along with you, a constant series of innovations that keep you ahead of the curve, a unique form of distribution that you can dominate or control for a period of time, a speed to market where you build a customer base that suddenly becomes a lock-in. Those things are as effective, if not more effective, than the margin compression of patents. In the case of Priceline, we had patents which helped us at the time because we were fairly early in the patent world in understanding you could patent innovative business systems. It helped us raise some capital, just a little bit of help, where people said, well, gee, you couldn't get copied. And truthfully, when Microsoft directly copied the Priceline model, they eventually had to stop because Microsoft couldn't directly copy the patented system of Priceline. And even to this day, there is no other name your own price service like Priceline. But there's Expedia and Orbitz and Travelocity and 50 other innovative ways to buy travel, which doesn't mean that because you have a patent, you have anything other than an ability to prevent margin compression in your zone. The patent system is badly broken, however, and so as a result, it only favors people with an extraordinary amount of resources. If you don't have millions and millions of dollars to spend on attorneys and also to spend on a spectrum of patents, and if your patents haven't issued before you even started, something which is hard to do nowadays given the pendency period in the patent office, which is why they're out here hiring patent examiners, okay, then the fact that you have a pending patent is near worthless in the United States. It's worth nothing abroad. Okay? And so as a rule, I tell almost all inventors, that the patent system is not going to be your big value-added advantage, which is not to say you wouldn't file a provisional patent if you had something that was simple and patentable, or that you should avoid at least trying, especially if you're going to sell out. One of the nice things is a big company that buys a patented series of pending patents might say, Greg, you've got patent coverage, we're a big company, okay? We understand, we're IBM, we've got more patent attorneys than we know what to do with, we couldn't fit them all in this room, so we might buy you out because we like the fact that you have some patents applied for it, which is a different strategy than actually going to market with your patents. It's basically selling a place in line or a position, and those things can be quite valuable. Now, that being said, every case is different, every market is different, every industry is different. In the case of Priceline, it made very little difference other than in the PR. And then ultimately when we went public, it gave us an enormous set of headaches as everybody tried to figure out what would happen if we lost our patents. And our answer was, nothing would happen if we lost our patents. It's about customers, not patents. And of course, customers don't care whether you have patents or not. Questions? So the question is, do I have any new ideas every waking minute for new business models? We don't talk about those things. I run an R&D lab, so as an inventor, it's not the kind of thing we share with the public. But what I can tell you is there is so much opportunity to invent new business models, so much opportunity to invent new ways of creating value, that it's almost like close your eyes and aim and shoot. So this is an issue where not a lot of people are spending time trying to figure out new ways of doing business. Most people are still trying to figure out how to create a new service or a new product. So if you do focus on that, I can assure you there is an enormous amount of opportunity in that space. Yeah. I never really talk much about the stuff we hold or own. I have about 300 issued U.S. patents and about 1,000 pending. So I do a lot of inventing and have for the last 15 years. What I can tell you is typically your inventions surprise you. You have an invention that you think is really great, and of course you're wrong, it's not so great, okay? Then you have an invention you don't think is too hot, and somebody comes along and goes, that's the most fantastic thing, we want to license it from you. So what you learn over time is a humility, and you also learn a portfolio effect if you're an inventor. So if you're an inventor, you're better off inventing 10 or 15 different things and spreading your risk among many things, assuming you can do some quality there, than you are putting all of your eggs in one basket and then hoping that that basket is really going to pay off for you, unless of course you have a day job, in which case you can afford that kind of approach. So I avoid trying to predict which of my inventions may turn out to be better than others, but sort of like children, you love them all. The back of the room then. Question is, does the patent system incentivize innovation or not? The answer is definitely yes. Offering people property rights for their inventions incentivizes the creation of property. I know there's a lot of things we wouldn't do, for example, if we could not get intellectual property protection, because it takes a lot of time and effort. The pharmaceutical industry would barely exist if you didn't have patent protection. Just go to India and take a look at the new pharmaceuticals they have not come up with. All right, so the fundamental nature of property is, and has been for all of human history, a very powerful motivator. A patent is a bargain. It's very simply a bargain between the individual and the state. And the bargain is, I will teach the world how to make my invention with total disclosure so anyone of ordinary skill can make it. And in return, I'll receive a limited and reasonable grant of exclusivity of preventing others from directly copying me. When that bargain is properly managed and properly balanced, society benefits, the individual benefits, everybody's a winner. When the bargain is not managed properly, when, for example, grants of monopoly are given erroneously or too broadly or without accuracy, or on the other side, when people abuse and game the system because there are a lot of people who have taken advantage of the system for so incredibly long period of time, it's beyond belief. You look at those kinds of issues and you can see a broken system. It's a little bit like looking at the US Congress. When it operates in theory, it's a pretty damn good place. But when it operates in practice, it's often a whole lot of problems. So you've got a lot of balances, and like any system that ossifies over a period of time, it has all kinds of functional and dysfunctional elements. And I think Congress and others have a real challenge ahead of it to get the patent system back to a much better and more valuable state of balance in publishing applications in advance and allowing the community to comment on applications and all kinds of innovations that would be so relatively obvious in our time and age. And if it wasn't for the political nature of very powerful vested interests that don't want that system to be reformed, in many cases like the healthcare system, you have a lot of dysfunctional elements in the patent system. That said, the patent office is staffed by good people generally trying to do the best job they can, and it's not fair to pick on them when in many cases the system itself drives a lot of it. The question is, as an inventor, what do I see for the US education system as I look into the future? Man, we were talking about this just at lunch today. Really good things, okay? We are living at the end of the industrial age of education, just at the very end. We're living at the end of the age of the book, and we're living at the end of the age of the industrial schoolhouse. It will be gone probably in a fairly short period, surprisingly short period of time. I mean, very surprising. The educational system has never looked better for the future than it does today, and it's never ever looked as good as it does today. Pay no attention to the schoolrooms, pay no attention to the unions and to all the government problems. That's irrelevant. All right, when I look to the future of education, look to YouTube, look to the web, look to massively multiplayer online games, look to the integration of entertainment and education, look to the power of homeschooling and the motivation of parents, look to the fact that when education is fun, it's not education. Okay? And kids have already discovered this by the billions. You know, we don't have to train fighter pilots anymore because every video game in the world does it. Okay? And as you have more and more broadband right to the ends of the network nodes and more capacity for real-time processing of essentially three-dimensional, you know, reality is about 16 million polygons a second, as we like to say. And you can't distinguish it at that speed. You realize that education is not going to be about teachers in classrooms. It's going to be about kids getting excited and learning, okay, and doing all kinds of stuff in new kinds of ways. I was talking to somebody in the car earlier about the game of Spore. For those of you that are familiar with the new game Spore, which I don't know has 5 or 10 million people playing it already. You add a simple genetics education module to that thing and you've got a college-level genetics course, literally. And there's no need to do anything more than learn it that way. You know, you create animals, you create ecosystems, you set them in the wild, you compete against each other, you have fun. You look at robot competitions on college campuses, it has nothing to do with go to classes. These kids are all inventing robots, and they're having the world's greatest time doing it. Right? What's so phenomenal about our age is that because the network disintermediates censorship, fundamentally anybody who tries to censor something doesn't win. Unless you bring the whole network down, which even China has chosen not to do. All right? The only place that's left to do that is North Korea. So unless you bring the whole network down, everybody on the network's always learning. And they're moving at the speed of the network. You can't censor the network. Well, guess what? A school is a sensor on the network. All right? If you abstract it, that's all it is. Well, guess what? I might go to school for a couple hours a day, or my parents might declare me homeschooled and just let me get on the network and have the world's greatest time, because when you look at the homeschooling kids and how they do in higher education, they do every bit as good, or if not better, than the kids who went through the school system. Well, guess what? In America, parents are not going to be forced to send their kids to school. Just not going to happen in our country. If our parents choose to, and we can prove that our kids are getting an education and really it's a good one, there's nothing going to stop that for us. I don't care how powerful your unions and politicians are. Just not going to happen. Which in China, it's a different story though. But in America, not going to happen. And since we're willing to educate women, and since we're willing to educate pretty much everybody who can think and talk, we are at an enormous advantage in the United States because we don't believe in testing in any real sense in this country. We don't believe that's the way you learn. We really believe at the end, we believe in standards, and we believe that if there's no accountability, that's trouble. But we don't, unlike the Europeans and the Asians who are all about testing for good grades, the Americans don't think that way. The Americans think, you learn anything? You know, all that school learning ain't too good for you. Why don't you go get a job and learn something? That's how America, whereas in the rest of the world, if you're a professor, oh my God, you know, oh, you're a professor. Not in America, okay? America, we look at our professors and go, hey, those that can't do, teach, right? That's sort of the American way. Right? And that's because our country was built on that ethos. It's the West and it's our history. It's a history of a nation that's very individually oriented, very oriented towards learn the stuff, do the stuff. You know, our great college dropout, Bill Gates, okay? He's the richest man in our country. The rest of the world's horrified that some college dropout. Our Americans proud of it. Damn kid dropped out of college, okay? You can too, okay? So that's the American way. So when you look at the future of American education, I'm not saying schools won't be an important part of the world, but you can bet higher education is going to be completely reinvented. That economic model is totally broken. Ask any parents paying for it, okay? Right? And you can bet that the primary and secondary school education is going to be reinvented by the web. These kids are going to be on cell phones. They're going to be wearing the web. It's going to be in their clothes, on all the time. You may not like what you see, but I can tell you it's as clear as day. All right? Education is going to look totally different in the post-industrial era. We are living at the end of the industrial age of education. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.